Good morning. I'm Laura Barasa from the University of Nairobi, and I sought to investigate So I sought to investigate the impact of mobile money payments on petty corruption, and the question was, would it be an effective intervention to bribery? And why this is important in the case of So in the case of Africa, we seem to have some issues with corruption. So we know that bribery is unethical, but it's quite normal in Africa. And we may say that maybe this happens because we mainly use cash and people underestimate being caught. So there are really no ways of tracking how much is exchanged. So we may have under-the-table deals. And one way that we sanitize the name bribery, we may call it informal payments, we may call them gifts, and in Swahili we call it kitu kidogo, something small to get the process going. And literature shows that bribery or informal payments could actually spur farm growth. That is in the event that government institutions are inefficient. But when they are not inefficient, it can constrain farm growth. So there are ambiguous or mixed results when it comes to the effect of bribery on farm performance. But nevertheless, we notice that in Africa, most of the corruption that occurs or that gains a lot of attention is at the national level. So most of the interventions target the government. They don't really target enterprises and how to help them overcome these making informal payments. And farms usually resort to complaining to government offices again, which might not be effective, or they complain through the ombudsman, you write a letter, or use a non-governmental organization. So some of these avenues may not be as effective, and my main motivation was, is there something else these companies or enterprises could do to circumvent corruption? Because fighting it, we still have a very long way to go, I will say. So first, it is very easy to conceal cash payments. We call them under-the-table deals. And I will say that when these payments are being made, perhaps the government official will ask you to shake their hand and pass something on to them. So it is undocumented. I think I've also seen policemen passing you a book and you place your cash inside and they take it back. So it cannot really be traced. So they can also be anonymous, but unfortunately, if they cannot be tracked, then at times it's really hard to say how much is being spent on these informal payments by companies, and what could they do to overcome this? And this is where mobile money comes in. And particularly for the case of Kenya and sub-Saharan Africa, mobile money has really dominated the financial industry. So it's an innovation that could be leveraged to overcome petty corruption. If we can convert the money into mobile money and make the payments, then some of the things we will notice is that we're going to have transactions that are backed with a digital trail and of records that is traceable, transparent, and this potentially reduces the opportunity space of government officials meeting with farm managers or having to talk to anyone. So perhaps by eliminating that physical contact, that may help in reducing petty corruption. So the main research question here is what is the impact of mobile money use on petty corruption, which I also define as informal payments, bribery, but I will not call it gifts because they are really not gifts, but people will insist that it was a gift. So in the theoretical review, the interventions that are there relate to the top-down interventions. For instance, the government may address its own employees and put in controls in the workplace to address corruption issues. The social accountability interventions, on the other hand, they target the citizens. So through media campaigns and capacity building, you try to get the citizens to denounce corruption as an evil, and perhaps that should bring some change. Then we have the behavioral interventions. So here we have media campaigns as well and some education to try to elicit some response from people. So when a cue is given regarding corruption, what reaction should people have? Ideally, they should be able to decide whether it's a wrong thing to do or whether it's a right thing to do, but hopefully this should elicit a reaction that deters corruption. And more interestingly was the empirical review. I came across some interesting study of a randomized control trial in Afghanistan. So the police force were making salaries through cash payments, and they decided to migrate these cash payments to use mobile money instead. And what happened is after 1 month or so, the junior policemen collected their salaries from their mobile phones, and they thought they had a salary increment, only to realize that the senior policemen used to sort of take a cut out of the junior policemen's salaries. So a case of transparency, mobile money bringing in the issue of transparency. And then again in Tanzania, for water utility services, this study was descriptive, but the main finding was that mobile money actually reduced the incidence of corruption. So the small exchanges that were being made were minimized through the use of mobile money. So from this, I attempted to develop a results chain to come up with a theory of change, where we have inputs relating to resources and particularly investing in the use of mobile money technology. So the main activities will be using the mobile money payment systems for transactions. And of course, we'll expect to see increased digital records. And one of the outcomes will be improved transparency. You'll be able to trace these payments so that they are no longer traceable, they are no longer anonymous. And this is because using mobile money requires very stringent identification procedures. You need to give in your identity, and when you register your line, even as a company, you need to give in your name, your ID, where you come from, where you work, and so on. So it doesn't matter how many lines you register, you can be traced. So finally, that should result in reducing petty corruption. So the data that I used is from the World Bank Enterprise Surveys. There are 2 waves of data for Kenya, for manufacturing and service firms in Kenya. And this data is collected using the stratified random sampling technique. And the sample is representative of the private sector in Kenya. So the kind of data that we have, the structure looks this way. So we have Kenya, and the first data point, or what I call the baseline, this data was collected between the periods of 2004 and 2006. And then in 2007, we had the mobile money launch in Kenya. And the end-line data that I use is the World Bank Enterprise Survey for data collected between 2010 and 2012. And it's sort of a panel, so we have about 151 firms, and I basically work with exploiting the mobile money launch to identify the causal impact of mobile money on informal payments or bribery. So the treatment here is mobile money use, and companies are asked to report whether they use mobile money for any of their transactions. And the outcome variable, I call it bribe intensity. So firms, the managers are asked to report, or the owners of the firms, approximately how much do you pay as informal payments out of your total annual sales? So that is what I use as the measure. And the pretreatment covariates that I use include firm characteristics such as size, age, managerial experience, the sector, and similar, and so on. So whether firms have access to credit or external financing. So the empirical strategy that I applied is the matched difference in difference approach. So we first match the data on the pretreatment variables, and this helps us to get the a valid comparison group. And after that, we do the difference in difference, and This corrects for the differences that are fixed over time and reduces the risk of bias. So it's a combination of two methods. So the econometric specification there just tells us that we are looking at the effect. So we look at the comparison group versus the treatment group. So what are the outcomes? And so we also use the weighted techniques, so the kernel matching weights. And this will help us be able to identify whether the mobile money really has any effect on the outcome. So looking at the balance on the baseline characteristics, there were no differences between the control group and the treated group at all, so telling us they were similar to start with. And another issue that came up, we really cannot test the parallel trend assumptions since there's no prior data to check out the 2 points just before the launch. So what I tried to do was to use falsification tests using a fake treatment group, and farms from Rwanda, I used that because I think Rwanda is way better than Kenya in terms of institutions. So we should not be able to detect any impact of mobile money on the outcome variable. And also another placebo or fake outcome that I used was power outages. So power outages in Kenya are rather frequent, but they are not theoretically or in any way related to mobile money use. And the results of those two falsification tests show that there's a zero impact across both of them. So perhaps that should give us a good ground to justify the means using the methods that I did. So the findings are that mobile money actually has a negative effect on informal payments. And so using the OLS, we still see the negative sign, though it is not significant, but the basic diff in diff is significant, and as we move on to the matched diff in diff, it gets more significant. And this will tell us that perhaps this is looking at mobile money and any digital innovation, we could be able to find ways of leveraging their use in fighting things like corruption. So we may, in some of my discussion, perhaps linking the theory of change to the discussion, it's the digital records that may actually deter people from trying to hide transactions, since you really cannot hide transactions. You will be traced no matter what. And when we rule out anonymity, this will essentially reduce the scope of petty corruption, because petty corruption, I think, is basically motivated when people don't think they'll be caught. And if they think they'll be caught, then we should see a reduction in some of the behaviors that we see in Africa. So in the conclusions, I would say that the study just offers useful insights on how we could conceptualize fighting petty corruption. And what's very attractive about using mobile money is that enterprises have direct control over the use of this application. So they really don't have any other influence. It's an option they could be encouraged to undertake. It's as well a monitoring mechanism for enterprises and for the government. And it's practical to use. I will say perhaps in the end, the transaction costs may be cheaper than having to bribe periodically. And we could also think of how we can use other digital innovations as tools for fighting corruption. And I will say that for Africa, as much as we talk about the convergence theory, we seem to be converging towards corruption, which is very sad, but we could fight it using digital innovations. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Laura, for your presentation. First of all, I'd like to say that I like the paper, and I think what you're after is an important issue. I do believe that electronic payments are an effective, optimal way of fighting corruption and tax evasion. And this is not, I think it's not only restricted to developing countries. I am from Italy, and also there it's the use of electronic forms of payment to fight tax evasion is a hot topic. So this is very topical, I think. And yeah, I think this paper shows how related to cheap technology, once the network is already there, can be actually effective, can effectively modify incentives. And I like the data that you use. This firm level data with this panel structure allows for, for some rigorous investigation. So a couple of comments that I have is, of course, here you didn't have much time during the presentation, but in the paper I would like to read more about mobile money payments, just how does it work exactly, and in which context can it be used. So can it be easily used in all contexts, like with both tax, firms? I would like to hear a bit more about that. And in terms of the implementation in Kenya, so you said it was launched in 2007, but I would like to know, was it launched uniform throughout the whole countries? Was in some areas the implementation a bit slower, more difficult, came a bit later? I think that's something that is important to consider and that you could exploit in the analysis too at some point. And also in terms of its usage by the firms, are some firms is it more easy to use for some firms with respect to others in terms of their activity? Because, so in other words, here I'm asking, is there a selection of the firms that get to start using this mobile money payments? And regarding that, there are variables. I had a look at the world value and the enterprise survey data. There are some variables saying, okay, why don't you use mobile money? And they give a series of reasons, so you could look into that. Now, regarding matching, just wanted to ask whether you could talk about different matching methods. So instead of weights, using nearest neighbor matching, see how result change. Regarding the propensity score, you show us you match firms based on some fundamental characteristics, the sector, the size. Those are, of course, the most important. But so the enterprise service, they have really a lot of data. I think it's a really rich data set. So I was wondering why you didn't use more of it. Since there are a lot of variables, I think you could match the firms some more and also control for more of these characteristics. So I just want to know, or at least if you could justify why you just went for those variables. And I think that for the sample you could also use the firm location. I mean, it's a bit aggregated. You have the region of the firms, but you could also use that, the region where the firms were sampled. And now regarding the placebos, I just wanted to hear perhaps why you think, I mean, I'm sure you know more of this than me, but I just wanted to know why you think random firms are a good placebo group, or this just justify, or show some comparison tables. And for the placebo outcome, I just wanted to say that you could also perhaps check whether the function of briberies also change over time for these firms. You say that they use this to get things done. Usually that's what bribery is used for. So you have some questions that could be proxies for that. So there are questions asking how much of an obstacle are tax administrations and permits. That's the context where they will use bribes. So you could check whether that has changed over time for the firm. And I don't want to take too much time, so I think I'll skip this part and I'll send you by email the rest of the comments. Right. So now, if you want to apply for this question, or otherwise I think that's rubbish.
Yeah, I'd like to find out if there are any other questions before I could try and address some of his. Yeah.
I'm wondering if maybe someone here discussing about this. I'm wondering about the differences between firms. It seems like your mental model is that the government officials are the ones demanding bribes, and it seems like often the firms are also the ones offering bribes. And there's potentially a difference between firms who are victims and firms who are perpetrators. And it might be that their use of mobile money is different. That is, if you're planning on doing your business through bribing officials and getting a leg up in your business, you're not likely to use mobile money.
Hi, and just to explore that particular element, I think just getting some sense of whether you looked at different sectors, different natures and functions of the businesses, just getting a sense of where your variation was coming from would be nice, and maybe even could provide some evidence on that topic.
Interesting study, Laura. I think my question is also in line with that, but also more on what we actually observe in the data, whether it's minus corruption already. Because if I know that if you pay through mobile money, and of course I cannot ask for corruption to be also channeled through mobile money, it would be, okay, pay me, but I will send you someone to get me my other kitu kidogo, as you call that small gift. So then what you observe that is that goes through mobile money is still minus the corruption. And again, if they mentioned it, it's not documented, it would remain the same problem. Number two, I was looking at the real application of the findings. I don't know whether in Kenya it's like Uganda, where you have a cap on how much you can transfer via mobile money. Like you can really not put $100,000 through mobile money. So then it would mean, I don't know how it is in Kenya, the application of that. It would mean that it's real, like you call it, it's petty, like real these small transactions. Then number three, I think it comes back to the question on exploring what kind of transactions are these. Because you gave an example of taxi, or rather of policemen. Policemen, I don't know whether you can pay through mobile money. It will always, they will have to issue this book. And there are quite a number of those petty kinds of corruption that go where you cannot use mobile money. So it would be also interesting, I think, to bring out the context and show what exactly was are the kind of transactions that you have in your analysis. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start with how mobile money may work in an enterprise. So basically what happens is that for utility companies like water and electricity, they register a number, a business number, and you can make your payments for electricity or water through that directly without having to contact anyone or to pre-register. So I think that may already help in overcoming making informal payments if you have to meet people. So the main argument is that if we sort of eliminate the physical meetings, we should at least see some negative effect. But then, however, there may be variations depending on the business sectors and the firms. I will have to look into that. I'm not sure what I will find, but I think it's interesting to look at. And yeah, it's possible that some firms which want to move up or to grow quickly may leverage on making informal payments. So yes, there's the possibility that side cash payments may be made, but I believe that will have to also be more limited than without having to use mobile money. Like for instance, For an enterprise to register and get an operating license, we nowadays do it using what we call the e-citizen. It's a portal. So you just log on to it and you make your payments through M-Pesa. So you don't have to get middlemen to do this sort of thing for you. And when you include middlemen, government officials are usually in the mix, and that is where this form of petty corruption comes in. So it may not be the cleanest estimation, but at least I know we are starting somewhere, that we can actually circumvent corruption, and I'm saying that from experience. And to come back to your questions, you asked how mobile money works exactly. I think I'll put more information about that in the paper. I think it's totally missing. And yeah, why mobile money is not used, I think there's also a question on that in the survey, because not all the firms embrace mobile money, but we really don't know why. Yet I think it's a way that they could use to circumvent corruption. So maybe meaning in some areas it is more prevalent than others, or the reasons they don't embrace it, yeah, I don't know about that. I'll have to find out. And using Rwanda as, you asked whether using firms from Rwanda is are they a good placebo? And yeah, that's just using theory. Rwanda is quite different from Kenya, and we expect much lower levels of corruption anyway. So we don't expect to see any effect, a significant effect there. Meaning that if we found one, then there would be a problem with reporting the results. Yeah, so it's using the fakest treatment group possible. At least that's how I see it. Yeah. Yeah.
So I just do that? Okay, I also want to touch on an aspect of the effectiveness of government expenditure. But I want to do so talking about information in the public sector. So in a market environment, information organically arises from the market process. Traders post prices, and then as people walk down the market, they can see those prices and they demand. So the equilibrium arises as an organic function of the market process. That's not true in the public sector. In the public sector, there's no equivalent information aggregation mechanism. And so the question that I want to talk to you about today is, well, how does information distribute itself across public sector institutions? So this is work with a PhD student who's just finishing at UCL, University College London, called Ravi Samani. And what we want to really understand is sort of what are the determinants of the distribution of information in the public sector. And this paper is going to look at two aspects of that. Firstly, descriptively, what do public officials know? Given the under-researched nature of this, I want to present some descriptive evidence on that. And then secondly, can we inform it? And traditionally, people have done so through evidence briefings that many of us try to produce for our counterparts. To what extent do those work in actually improving the accuracy of information that public officials have? Now, this is a literature that has foundations in theory. There's a broad set of papers, one of which, sort of the most famous, is Aghion et al.'s 1997 paper, that looks at the incentives for principals and agents, so a hierarchy, to inform themselves, given that there's a free-riding constraint. I want the other person, either the principal or the agent, to undertake the costly exercise of informing yourself. And so it's a game. And therefore, in a public sector environment, as theory would predict, it's very likely that there's going to be an incentive-based equilibrium, where principals and agents have to have some sort of game in which the equilibrium arises from the parameters of that game. And they provide a number of cases. For example, when you give power to one authority or another, so you give the principal the power to override decisions, well, then their incentive is to become informed. And similarly, when you give the agent authority, their incentive is to become informed. Now, related to the extent to which we can improve information to public officials, if that's the game that's happening in the public sector, they do find, and this is true in many parts of the literature, that if you can decrease the marginal cost to any public official of having to absorb information by giving them an evidence briefing, then you can raise the total amount of information. So let's see empirically what happens. Now, this literature is empirical and theoretical across quite a few different parts of the economics literature. So political economists have talked about decentralization, how principals and agents might have different information sets. Contract theory, like Gian and Troll, has kind of presupposed that there may be incentive reasons why this would differ. Decentralization more generally, and more generally in the determinants of public sector productivity. And so I'm going to try to sort of touch on each of these. So what do? We provide empirical evidence on the distribution of information through a survey of public officials, where we ask people about local conditions, and then we benchmark that against administrative and survey data on those exact same variables. We then try and collect other data about the incentives that public officials that we've surveyed are operating under. And we give some descriptive evidence of, is the theoretical sense that if you're given these incentives to acquire information, do we see improved accuracy of their beliefs? And then finally, we use an experiment to assess the possibility of improving that accuracy by providing a random subset of our officials with evidence briefings on these variables. So what do we find? Well, firstly, public officials make substantial errors in their beliefs. So there is a minority of the public officials that we study that are within 20% of the objective benchmark data. Sort of standard deviation, but a very large number, around half, are over 50% away from the benchmark data that we collect. So they're making very large errors on the fundamental quantities of their work. De facto power, so giving them the incentive for them to make the decision in particular projects, does substantially improve the accuracy of their beliefs. And evidence briefings also can have a big impact, similarly to the de facto power sort of scale of impact, on the accuracy of beliefs. However, in both cases, management practices within individual civil service organizations fully mediate the impact of power and briefings. The evidence I'm going to be showing you is from Ethiopia. So Ethiopia it's a very large, poor country, it's diverse, and therefore local constituency information matters for the delivery of public goods. It's a federal parliamentary polity. It's a large unified service. So these guys are all basically working under the same public service rules. But we have 3 tiers of government: federal, regional, and local. And although they have differentiated service responsibilities, all of them have to budget, all of them have to do some service delivery, and all of them have to use information to plan how resources are expended. So what we did is we went to a random sample of all 3 tiers of government, and we interviewed 1,831 public administrators in 382 organizations across 5 core sectors: agriculture, education, health, tax, revenue, and trade. We asked them about their basic demographics, so who they are and what work they have to do. We also asked them about their management, so the incentives under which they work. And then finally, we asked them an information module in which we said, tell us the extent to which your information on, and I'm going to give you some variables in a second, the population you serve, or in your sector, for example, education, a key characteristic like the net enrollment rate. So what we find when we ask them about information, when we ask them, where do you source that information, is that the knowledge they have is a key source of their decision-making information. Civil servants report that the 3 most important sources of information are their colleagues, citizens, and the supervisors. They very rarely state that they use MIS systems because of the limited computer access, network problems, and inadequate IT. And throughout the conversation that we've had with these civil servants, we find that much of the decision-making that they undertake depends on tacit understanding. So what they believe is the constituency characteristics that they face. Now you can go in and you say, well, public officials, when you go to their desk, typically have a lot of information on their desk. And a lot of the desks that you find in the Ethiopian civil service look a little bit like this. So what do they draw from this? They actually draw very little. So albeit that they have large records of constituency level work, what we're hearing from them is that when they make decisions on budgeting, when they make day-to-day decisions on the practical implementation of policy, they're using their tacit understanding. So that our survey of measuring knowledge of each official is a useful way to gain understandings of that tacit knowledge. We asked officials questions about the socioeconomic conditions of their citizens. And what we ask about, and I'm putting it all here so you can see how basic these questions are, is just simply, what's the population that you serve? What's the proportion of them that are rural? Tell me, in the education sector, we'll ask education officers, what's the primary enrollment and primary pupil class ratio? These were drawn directly from the strategy documents of the education sector, and these are all stated as sort of fundamental quantities that are used on a very regular basis by these public officials. So let me give you an example of what we did. So from the survey, we have the estimates of the population that each individual official says that they serve, and then from the census, we're able to benchmark the extent to which that is actually the population they serve. And what you see is a very disparate histogram for the estimates that they give us and the actual. What we can do is we can take these errors, so we subtract our benchmark data, which is always the sort of best survey data on those variables possible, or administrative data, away from the estimates. So for every official and for every variable, we have an error. And now we can start to understand what it is that those errors are being determined by. So the first thing we did was an ANOVA analysis to get some description of what's determining public officials' accuracy of their beliefs over their local constituency. There's certainly an impact of the environment. Errors are lower in districts with a lower poverty rate, a smaller population, and those that are less remote. But this explains a tiny fraction of the variation in the errors. If you ask about individual capabilities, so are individuals who are more experienced in their position in an organization or more educated, does that matter? We do find some effect, but again, it explains a tiny proportion of the variation. What's really explaining the vast majority of the variation is the institutional component. So the incentives they work under, the power that they're given. So what we find is tier of government, the amount of de facto power that individual civil servants are given, because decentralized agencies are allowed to do a lot more policy making without centralized agreement, is that lower governments are making lower errors. I mean, control for sector, local government, indicator, and so forth. So really the comparison that we're making is claims about the same education variable in the same local government at the same percentile, conditioning on individual characteristics. So this is the sort of tightest comparison that has been available on that long-held assumption that individuals at the local level have better information. And what we find, conditioning on these things, is that local government has about half a standard deviation better information than people at the federal level, and there's no difference between federal and regional individuals. We're also able to assess whether managers have higher information errors, so whether they have less information. Sort of thinking of a principal agent model. And what we find is that there's very little difference at all when we look at managers. And so within public organizations, information is flowing relatively evenly. But across public organizations, there are large differences in the accuracy of public officials' error rates. So then we can start to think about incentives. And so we use the World Management Survey and refine the questions for an Ethiopian public sector setting. And what we're using is monitoring and targeting as measures of the extent to which information is valued in those organizations. And examples of the questions around monitoring is, in what kind of ways does your directorate track how well it's delivering its services? And does your directorate have a clear set of targets and so on? And so what we find is a large variation in the amount of management quality in the Ethiopian public service. And this really matters. So this is going back to our benchmark local government indicator. But what we find is that management practices related to monitoring and targeting are reducing the quality of information, reducing errors by 1/4 of a standard deviation. And we find that the interaction between local government and management practices, the management practices are really driving a lot of the effect that we find in decentralization. And we can see that by looking at this. So what we do here is we look at the impact of decentralization at different levels of management. So the percentile of management practices from 0 to 100 is on the x-axis, and the impact of decentralization is on the y-axis. And what you find is that decentralization is fully mediated by the quality of the incentives to monitor and to target, to use information. So that organizations with the least information are those that are least well managed, and decentralization is having no impact there at all. And similarly, when you have very well managed organizations, decentralizing to those organizations is very large. So now what we do is we randomly shock some organizations with an evidence briefing. Prior to the survey, we send a package of information on variables to a random subset of organizations. We have balance between control and treatment. What do we find? We do observe a significant treatment effect. So what we find is that this treated claim, which is the second, is significant at the 10% level. And what we can do is we can then interact that with our management scores. And what we find is the effect is significantly mediated, again, by management. What we find here, if you look at the treated claim times management, is that management practices at the organizations who have the worst management, providing evidence briefings is increasing the quality of their information substantially. So looking at in a graph, what we find again with management quality on the x-axis and the impact of the evidence briefings on the y-axis is that those organizations with really poor management, that's where evidence briefings are having the largest impact, because that's where the information did not exist prior to us providing that information to civil servants directly. Those organizations who have the best management relative to increasing the incentives for information, the evidence briefings are having no impact at all. So when we as researchers provide evidence briefings to organizations, they're having an impact on average. But they're having the largest impacts in places where that pre-existing information did not exist. And they're having very limited impact where the incentive is already there for public officials to go and search that information out themselves. So we present a framework for assessing the knowledge of public officials and provide substantial descriptive evidence on the determinants of the accuracy for their information. These determinants closely follow economic theory. We do find the evidence that the accuracy of the beliefs of public officials can be improved by these evidence briefings that communities like ours are producing at a sort of higher and higher rate over time. But public service incentives mediate the impact of information intervention. So there's some interaction here between our efforts to inform public officials ourselves and by improving their baseline incentives, the baseline rules that they work under. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that interesting paper. And talking about information, that is critical, especially in the setting, the Ethiopian setting. We can also consider it in the sense of sub-Saharan Africa. So in my understanding, what you try to do is to experimentally examine how reducing the cost of information affects the access to this information. And of course, we would expect that when there's more access to this information by public officials, we should see some positive effects. And what I found interesting was that the public officials seem not to really know, seem to have very poor estimations of the areas they're in charge of. And this may lead to poor targeting of public resources because there's simply no information. And one phrase that I kept seeing is this can lead to economically meaningful mistakes. And it would be very good if you exactly explained what those are because I can imagine there are many, but relating them to the sectors that you studied. What have you observed, or what does the data tell you? So which mistakes are really there? Are they real or imagined? And thinking again of this setting, is it possible that there could also be an issue of maybe the ethnic angle, that if I am not serving in an area that I come from, I really do not care about how resources are allocated. I really don't care about the people here. So I will not want to invest much in getting the correct information. And if I am serving in an area where I belong to, I may want to skew the resources towards the people because I'm attached to them. That is where I come from. So something else that has not come out clearly for me when we talk of absorption of that information, exactly how is the transmission process like? So once we get the information package, what do we do with it? How does it translate to these outcomes? Or how could you explain it to someone? How will that absorption work, and how will it translate to any meaningful outcomes? And that will help when we consider what the economically meaningful mistakes really are. Then we can be able to see, is this information package being used? So as much as the officials get the information, depending on what they already know, so could the misallocation be intentional or unintentional, and what implications does that have? Yeah. So I think I would encourage you to talk about the economic consequences. And something else that I need to highlight, you have stated that as much as we have the public sector and the private sector, that if we assume that they have the same hierarchical conditions and structures, then we should see similar effects. But at least from where I come from, public sector and private sector are pretty different. So even if you were to observe the same hierarchical structures, the motivation for taking action is very different. One is profit seeking, the other is there to serve the people. And perhaps some attitudes and beliefs might just be embedded in the people and where they come from. And again, ideally, like in government, some people may be there knowing that their jobs are secure, so they really don't need to bother about anything. But in private sector, since they are profit-oriented, we may see a different attitude set. And perhaps you could also consider what some of those attitudes may be in the private sector if you are to compare them in the public sector. So I think it's a bit of a stretch unless you really support it. Yeah. And also you talk about looking at subjective beliefs. And we know that when you talk of these subjective beliefs, it may be difficult to support them. Is there any other objective measure that could be used as a proxy? Yeah. Thank you.
So what we do in the paper in terms of economically meaningful mistakes is we present two pieces of evidence, one a thought experiment on the population data, and show that the disbursement of grants, given the information there, is over-dispersed by about 30% to the 75th percentile and under-dispersed by the 12%. So just in terms of providing grants equitably across the population, you're seeing sort of very large deviations in resource distribution. And then similarly, in the education sector, we relate to evidence that shows that enrollment rates through the provision of this kind of information increased by about 1.2%, simply from this, this type of information together. So, more generally, I think the argument here is we're trying to understand how information flows in the public sector because of the limited evidence that has existed on that in the past, because we, don't have a good model of that. And we don't have good empirical evidence. The idea that this may be different in the private sector, I fully agree with, because of the sort of starting motivation. But actually, Kahneman's got a new sort of series of pieces of work where they look at related issues in the private sector. So they look at the consistency of decision-making in the private sector, and they actually find very, very large divergence across individual agents in the same firm taking the same decision. So, you know, I think any bureaucracy, any hierarchy is likely to be beset by some of these issues. In terms of the ethnic angle, we don't really find any sort of issue here, you know, or interaction when you look at heterogeneity by ethnicity, but a lot of people in local districts, warders, are basically working in the same ward that they're from. And then finally, in terms of the translation of information to implementation, there's 2 points. One is, of course, this, we do present evidence on the scale of impact it's having, but secondly is that a lot of the variables that we're talking about are issues that they're dealing with on a daily basis for standard project implementation or grant implementation, etc. Yeah. Sorry.
Thanks, Dan. The paper looks awesome, and it's absolutely rammed with information that people like me are going to be using in the future. I have actually just sort of two related questions. What exactly the evidence intervention? Is it basically a fact sheet, or is it something, so it's not something that requires interpretive? So my question is really, a lot of the information that you've drawn is basically from Ethiopian government sources. It's from, presumably, it's somewhere in an almanac that is sitting somewhere in that massive pile of papers on a desk. So in a sense, there's a question about whether your information, your fact sheet, is an information treatment, or if it's just something that overrides the incentive structure that prevents people from acquiring and retaining the information, which it's not trivial, because actually if the work is mainly done by overriding the incentives, then the applications of this kind of approach are broader. If it's mainly an information treatment, then you're going to be limited by people's interpretive ability as well, in terms of what you can actually add in there. But it's just something to think about, really, I guess.
No, I totally agree. Should I take each question as it comes? So in terms of what we're doing is reducing the marginal cost, be it in salience, I agree, almost certainly was on that table. And so what we're doing was basically reducing the marginal cost. Now, that may have spillover effects onto other areas that they've been absorbing information, which I hadn't thought of, and I think it's very nice to think about. But of course, these are the core variables of their work. So I agree. That's a nice way of sort of thinking about the evidence brief, yeah.
Hi, Dan. Increased knowledge of like a particular sector for government officials, what does it mean in terms of performance?
So that's a little bit the answer I was giving before. So we talked about, in the paper, a couple of ways of thinking about that. One, and there's a pre-existing evidence, so Finan has this recent paper on kind of the impact of MIS systems. So does Mike Callan and co-authors, sort of showing the impact of these information systems. What we're trying to do a little bit more is model the extent to which information itself can be informed by some of the efforts that researchers like ourselves are making. And there it's long-term impact. We do this thought experiment plus show evidence from the education sector that they have these real-world implications. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I find super interesting, mostly the part in which you say that the effect of the treatment can be even larger when the priors are already higher. And I was thinking of the implications of your findings in terms of changes in the political cycle, like driven by the political cycle. So if there's a change in the party, two underlying things can change, which are the priors. And I would have expected older people to be more reluctant to update their priors. But I wanted to also ask you if there are any evidence of how managerial practices change with that and how stable they are. Because they can also change, and then your treatment can have some different implications regarding these two underlying factors.
Yeah. So our data management practices from a cross-section. So in this context, we're not going to be able to give some sort of panel dimension that you'd like to see. So actually with Martin Williams, who's not here, but who's at Oxford, myself and Imran Rasool, we've actually just for the first time collected WMS, World Management Survey, twice. So once, and this was in Ghana, once 5 years ago and once just recently. And it is interesting, you do see change. The determinants of that may very well be staffing changes, as you suggest. We're looking into whether, there is sort of some institutional political reasons for that. There's also quite a lot of stickiness in the public service. And what's interesting is that there's no homogenizing forces like there might be in a private sector institution. So it's a frontier question. I think it's something I can't answer in the Ethiopian setting. The best evidence we have from Ghana is that there is stickiness, although manager changes do seem to make some difference as well.
This is just to understand the first part of the paper properly. It's like where you're showing the motivations related to the information asymmetry. So I was trying to understand whether the questions that were asked within the same organization, so across hierarchy, and whether the questions that were asked for the same institution that were at a different administrative level, so basically regional or the national level, were the same or were they different? So basically I was trying to understand when we are looking at the errors, how should we interpret them?
Yeah, so each comparison that you saw was basically comparing for the regression of a manager versus a non-manager, was individuals in the same organization, so a Warada, a district government, in the same sector, so it's the health office of the Warada, and then being asked the same questions. When it's across tiers, it's comparing those people to the health sector officer in the region and the ministry who are working on the same Warada. So it's always trying to basically make precise the comparison over what you're asking about, and then changing the institutional incentives of the individuals being asked about. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about this project, which is joint work with my colleagues Karl-Johan Dalgaard and Nikolai Korsen in Copenhagen, and our friend Ola Olsson in Gothenburg, in Sweden, which is a study about Roman roads and the contribution of this type of infrastructure that was built during antiquity and the creation of prosperity, which is also a study on the characteristics of persistence and non-persistence of public goods. Okay, so this pattern of persistence in comparative development is very well documented. There's a long literature documenting it. So there's a large literature that basically shows that societies that were relatively economically developed in pre-industrial times tend to be comparatively more successful today. There are examples of this pattern exploiting variation across countries. For example, the work by Diego Comin and co-authors showing that technological differences were persisted for millennia in pre-modern times, and in particular that countries that were closer to the technological frontier 500 years ago are still comparatively richer and more technologically sophisticated today. There's also examples that exploit within country variation. The paper by Felipe Valencia, for example, with his co-author shows this pattern of persistence across subnational regions in the colonies. They show that colonialists chose to settle close to existing native populations to exploit advantages related to labor, trade, knowledge, defense, and places that were more prosperous 500 years ago tend to stay prosperous today. So I can show you now another example of this strong pattern of persistence. This is, for example, the relationship between population density today and population density in the year 500 in the area that was covered by what was the Roman Empire around the beginning of the 2nd century. So this is a correlation that shows again this strong pattern of persistence. More populated places 500, in the year 500 are still more populated places today, more than 1,000 years after. Okay, so this pattern of persistence led to abundant research on the origins of comparative development. Where do these differences come from? And then this led to lots of research about initial conditions, initial geographic conditions, or initial historical process that shape somehow the culture or the institutions that create this strong pattern of persistence. But from there are really interesting questions like, when does this strong pattern of persistence break down? When does persistence disappears? How does persistence disappear? And so this is a question that is interesting, but and there's another question that is also very interesting, is the one that we are focusing on this paper, which is this examining of the channels through which persistence comes about. What explains, what connects stuff that happened in the past to stuff of the future? What is the mechanism that drives this pattern of persistence? And so in some sense, it's exploring persistence in proximate determinants of differences in development, in comparative terms, as compared to the origins of persistence in fundamental determinants of differences in comparative development. And this could be useful because it could reveal which fundamentals are important and how to potentially stimulate development in situations where some of these fundamentals are not present. Okay. So we study persistence. We focus on to examine persistence in proximate determinants. We chose this intriguing example of physical infrastructure, which was this. So this is what we are studying. This is an example of a road that is currently in Timgad, a city that is 200 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast between Algeria and Tunis, that was founded in the year 100, and that is a remarkable early highway. It's a paved road that can be used during the entire year, all weather, and it's part of a network of more than 80,000 kilometers of roads that were built during approximately 500 years by the Romans. And then this is an interesting. This is interesting to look at because it provides interesting quasi-experimental variation. These roads did not really follow modern rules of infrastructure planning, so they were not really built to connect places of existing economic activity in order to enhance economic activity. They were basically built for militaristic purposes, to move troops and to expand the presence of Rome in the newly conquered areas of the empire. They were, historians have documented that these remarkable long, straight parts of the roads network, which suggests that the Romans were not really trying to evade geographic obstacles, but rather to surmount them. Why? Because that was the easiest, perhaps also the cheapest way to transport troops, for example, from A to B, just construct a straight road between them. So despite this idiosyncratic nature of roads, the militaristic orientation of the Romans to build these roads and not the mercantilistic orientation to build these roads, we find this remarkable pattern of persistence of these roads built in antiquity and modern roads. So there's in places where there's more 1% more higher density of roads built by Romans, we find still today 0.25 more modern roads today. Okay? And we also document the economic effects of these roads. We find that roads are associated with higher economic activity during antiquity. So higher presence of roads created economic activity by the end of the first half of the first millennium, when the Roman Empire started to collapse. But interestingly, we also find that this relationship between infrastructure and economic activity goes beyond antiquity. So we find that the relationship between Roman roads and economic activity persists until today. To identify this pattern of persistence, we basically just looked at the area that was covered by the Roman Empire around the year 117, and and try to compare places that had more roads with places that had less roads, and try to see whether this correlates with the presence of more modern infrastructure and more modern economic activity and earlier economic activity. So for doing that, we try to be very, diligent in collecting data about potential confounders of economic activity. And we also make an effort to make a very fine comparison. So when Romans were building roads, they were expanding not only physical infrastructure, they perhaps were also expanding new ideas about, diets, calendars, culture, religion. So in order to disentangle the infrastructure component of this Roman package of influence, we just try to compare places within the Roman Empire. So it's not Rome versus not Rome, it's just everything within Rome. And in order to compare places that had more roads with places that had less roads, we start making this comparison at the country level. But obviously there are large things that we cannot control for when we compare, for example, areas that were in Germany or in France with areas that were in Morocco or in Algeria. So in order to reduce the concern that country and observable country differences are driving this result, we always use country fixed effects. And even, on top of that, we also add some regional fixed effects and within country variation that explains, because it could be, for example, that there are some parts of France or some parts of Germany that had some, for example, cultural advantage or some cultural to organize themselves and build and maintain in a better way the roads as compared to some parts in Algeria or in Morocco. So in order to do that, we also add language fixed effects. So, and we start to exploit differences within these cultural areas, within countries, within the Roman Empire. So, and on top of that, we make a very fine comparison at the intensive margin. We don't compare areas that have roads with areas that didn't have roads. We just compare areas that had roads with places that had a little more roads. Okay? So, making this in comparison at the intensive margin, we find results that show this strong pattern of persistence, the relationship between roads in antiquity and modern roads, and the economic effects of these roads in antiquity that go beyond the end of antiquity. And in order to try to, well, we say we're using lots of controls, but we could also be omitting some things that are difficult to measure or we cannot just observe. So so we propose in the paper a second identification strategy exploiting a natural experiment. Essentially, the natural experiment is this one, is essentially exploits the historical event where transportation of goods in the Middle East and the north of Africa became approximately 20% cheaper, and this is something that happened around the first half of the first millennium. And according to historians, this happened because of a confluence of several things. So at the beginning of the first millennia, these tribes that were herding camels started to develop some saddles that allowed them to carry weapons. So these tribes that were herding camels started to gain military presence. And by the first half of the first millennium, Rome started to decline, and in the year 632, Islam consolidated and marked the end of the Roman era. So in the north of Africa and in the Middle East, roads were not necessary any longer, in the sense that camels didn't really need to use roads to transport goods and things because camels could traverse any type of terrain, whereas this was not the case in the European part of the Roman Empire, because the useful, more efficient means of transportation in this part were carts pulled by oxen or horses. So this natural experiment helps us to produce two interesting testable implications, because we should expect that in the north of Africa and in the Middle East, the link between modern roads and roads built in antiquity should break down. Well, why? Because they were not using they were using camels to transport goods. They didn't need roads, so the roads fell into disrepair until the early colonial period, where automobiles were basically reintroduced and they had to start building new roads. But these new roads did not have to follow any militaristic purpose. They probably had to follow more mercantilistic, more modern rules of infrastructure planning. And we could also test the idea that, well, if roads help to create more economic prosperity, then we should observe still in the Middle East and the North of Africa some effect of roads on economic prosperity, but this effect should only last until the end of antiquity. Once the roads are fell into disrepair in this region, then the relationship between roads, infrastructure in antiquity, and economic activity today should break down. So that is basically what we can confirm with our results. I'll just show you some more details from here, because I have given you the main results. Let me just show you, for example, the data. We collected data from lots of places, this digitized atlas of the medieval and the Roman and the Greek periods. We use satellite data. We use data built by anthropologists to define these areas of languages. We use archaeological data from archaeological repositories. And the data is basically this one. This is the main type of data. So we had some measure of local economic activity. This is the intensity of lights by night. The lines in red show the road of networks built by Romans, and the line in yellow shows the maximum geographical extent of the empire. Okay, so when we start zooming in is when these interesting correlations that we uncover start to appear. Places that have more economic activity are strongly related to the presence of these roads that were built into antiquity. Okay, so I'm going to skip all the tables and the history about showing that some evidence that of these militaristic purposes and the absence of these mercantilistic purposes for building roads, and I can show you the graph, the graph essentially, the results in a graph. This is the pattern of persistence. It's a very strong pattern showing, for example, here we are showing the density of Roman roads across regions, within cultural areas, within modern countries, and within the Roman Empire, and just at the intensive margin, comparing areas that had some roads with areas that had a little more roads. And this is the relationship, this is the persistence of infrastructure. Okay, so modern roads are following old roads, controlling even after making this demanding comparison. And these, the economic effects are still there, so the pattern of persistence in the entire empire in general looks like this, but that result, the persistent economic effects of infrastructure are essentially driven by the persistent economic effects of infrastructure within the European part of the former Roman Empire. The relationship between infrastructure in antiquity and economic activity today breaks down to the point of statistical insignificance in the Middle East and the North of Africa. Why? Because of this story about the abandonment of the wheel and the camel caravans. So, we think that it's interesting to uncover such an interesting pattern of persistence in approximate costs of development, of differences in development economics. And we also think it's interesting, these results are interesting because we can interpret them as supporting the idea that infrastructure or proximate determinants that are more closely related to second nature processes as compared to first nature processes like geography, if we borrow from the nomenclature in urban economics, tend to be an important cause of explaining the dynamics of persistence and non-persistence in comparative development. Yeah, thanks.
So, personally, love to read this paper, and so I'm so pleased that I've had to read it for this discussion. It was a joy, yes, to see this picture, because I don't know if everyone here feels the same, but I think if you're working in economic development and you live in Europe, or you work in Europe, everyone has that thought of, maybe I should do a Hadrian's Wall paper, or maybe I should do a Napoleon paper. But these guys did it. And so, I think it's just fantastic. It's something that I think lots of people would have loved to have done, and you've done a great job with it. So I was actually very excited about the conditional OLS regressions, and I have a few comments on what we call the natural experiment here, because just to be saying, what we're doing is we're taking a country, we're then taking a particular zone within a country, we're conditioning a lot of the geographic features of that, and that's the comparison we're making. So I thought that comparison was relatively tight. I don't know if you'd ever thought about doing some sort of matching exercise as a complement or a robustness test, on those geographic features. But I wanted to just kind of expand the conversation a little bit. So there is some previous existing literature on this, on ancient roads. So Melissa Dell's famous Peru paper, she actually does think of roads as the key mechanism under which the meter persists. And so she states, landowners were better able to secure roads through lobbying for government resources and organizing local labor. And these roads remain today. So she did note this as a potential persistent level. And then even within Europe, there's a nice paper, Val, which you do quote, studying the geographic discontinuity, a wall in Germany that divided Germany into Roman and non-Roman parts. And again, really thinking that the road network was a key developmental advantage. So this point, or related points, have been made before. And what you do is you expand that point nicely to the whole Roman Empire. And I think it's important to note here that this goes back to one of the fundamental discussions in economic development, which is, Saulo growth model asked, is it capital that drives economic development, or is it institutions, the sort of more recent discussion? And so in some ways, I thought in the paper you could actually motivate this even more broadly than you do as one of the fundamental arguments in the literature. Now, the sort of recent evidence, I feel, has, there's this tension between physical capital and institutions. The splitting of those things is sometimes difficult. And where that's tried to be done, so for example, Banerjee and Ayer's discussion of the princely states and so forth, I think they come down very much on the side of institutions. And it was the institutions that mattered here that, drove both the physical capital development and long-term outcomes. And then one of your co-authors, Olsen and Peck, have this paper where they actually find that early development in Europe actually had a negative impact in long term because of the institutions they set up. So Western agricultural core communities that adopted agriculture early, in fact, have weaker institutions and poorly functioning economies today. So I felt like the paper in some ways could cite itself slightly better within a very vibrant literature, because you've done such a great job. Yeah. So, one thing I think, just the first time I read the abstract, the macro claim that early infrastructure investments are an early prerequisite for modern day infrastructure, which you state, my first thought was there are lots of examples where that isn't true, right? Where there are sort of counterexamples. So the road infrastructure related to the Silk Road, perhaps the most famous road of all time, hasn't had that sort of long-term impact. Now, of course, developments of today seem to be implying that might change in the next 30 years, but for the last 100 years that hasn't been true. Similarly, Mesoamerican civilizations are famous for their complex and interconnected road infrastructure, and it didn't, hasn't sort of resulted in that sort of depth of infrastructure that we imagine. And similarly, on the converse, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, there was no pre-existing road infrastructure, and now they're very developed. So I just wanted to hear from you, actually, how do we cite this paper in a wider macro sense of how the world's infrastructure have developed? The interpretation for me was that this is purely physical capital. I think I still need to be pushed a little bit on that for the following reasons. So if you just imagine we randomly placed a road somewhere in the Roman, the Roman Empire, and then people just kept using it. So I can imagine multiple reasons why it would foster greater road density around it. I can imagine that you're right, but for multiple reasons. So the first would be purely technical, which is kind of what you're pushing, which is just the marginal cost of building new roads is lower. They've already kind of fostered markets along that road and so forth. But then Temin, and he has this Journal of Economic Perspectives paper where he argues that roads weren't just for military sort of development, they were really for developing new markets, right? Romans were going places to develop new markets, and so then the institutional factors start to creep in. So I'm kind of going down this list, moving towards institutions. So the first one is very technocratic. What if it's that the movement of people along these roads took Roman institutions, cultures, and norms with them? So do we think of that as that institutions didn't move along the roads? And then finally, were these roads actually mechanisms to get Roman institutions to geographic places? So was the point to expand the empire, and this is the way they did it? So I think just the interpretation, I think, is more towards the top of this list, and there are some reasons why you might think that it's also some of the other reasons. I'd love your thought. Then, now the natural experiment, so the endogeneity constraint here is that drivers of growth led to both the creation of the road network and later infrastructure or wealth creation. That's what we're trying to break. What we need, the exclusion restriction, is that the instrument develops infrastructure and wealth solely through these roads. But we know that at the same time, there's been big climactic changes in the Fertile Crescent. It was called the Fertile Crescent because it used to be incredibly fertile. And actually, climactic conditions have both changed the necessity for roads and the long-term wealth and infrastructure development along those routes. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit about how we think about sort of the whole development path of North Africa and Middle East. Do we think that there could be other reasons, even your co-author's paper, inviting the idea that particular institutions were adopted within those areas that were never going to value either roads nor wealth creation along those lines, and why we think we've got a valid exclusion restriction. In some ways, I thought that your first conditional regression was a really strong argument, and so I just wanted to hear a little bit more on defending this experiment. One last little pernickety thing. So this is, your core result comes from the comparison of these two graphs. At the extremes of measurement, so 0.3 and 0.2, there seem to be two outliers that potentially drive a lot of the result. Maybe that's not true. So if you just took away the bottom, this dot here, right, and one at the other side, you've got a pretty strong positive correlation. So I just wanted to hear if you've done any outlier or do we worry about those outliers at all? Generally, though, excellent work. Two quick things I was thinking, the current transport literature looks a lot at roads that were supposed to be built but then weren't, and whether there's any evidence on that due to peace, like they didn't need to build it because they didn't have to go to war, or there was a climate intervention or something like that. Maybe there was fungibility of resources, whether you'd thought about this. And then going back, is there any way that you can sort of measure state capacity? So Lee 2018 kind of comments on Banerjee and Iyer and says, well, really, it was state capacity that was important here. So have you thought about putting in some more measures? But generally, super exciting work, so well done.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Actually, my first thought was in a way quite similar to Dan's. The maintenance of roads, the maintenance of a road system is like a shorthand for a huge amount of institutional capacity. The ability to raise taxes, the ability to choose what to do, the ability to spend effectively, and so on. So there's inherently anywhere that's been able to maintain roads has had some minimum level of state capacity over that entire period. But the other thing I was thinking as well is that, so when in the Middle East they stop sort of maintaining the roads in the MENA region, is the argument there that from that point you see a wider divergence between, an increase in the divergence between MENA and Europe as a whole? Is this a general equilibrium effect or a partial equilibrium effect? So is the area around those roads becoming less developed, or is it, and are they shifting economic activity to other places? So I suppose in a way, one way of thinking about this is that mechanically, if you stop using roads, you're going to see a lot less economic activity over time. But is it just that they're shifting their effort to other places because of whatever climatic, geographical reasons, discovery of new natural resources, and so on? And I suppose in a way that's more important, because it might mean that they're not maintaining those roads because they've found other things that deserve their resources.
So to answer this last question, we're not really trying to explain differences across regions, but differences within regions, right? So there are multiple reasons for why, Europe developed better or faster than the Middle East and the North of Africa, but that's not really the question we're trying to address. We're trying to address, whether within Europe or within the Middle East or within the North of Africa, there are places that got more infrastructure, are also exhibiting this pattern of persistence and the economic benefits of that. So obviously we're not trying to answer that question. We're just exploiting on the within regions variation. So in that sense, differential capacity of the state or to collect taxes or resources to maintain roads is perhaps less of a concern. Yeah, unless there are really strong reasons to think that tax collection within certain parts of Europe or within certain parts of the Middle East was terribly much more effective than other places within these same regions. But that's probably policies for tax collection and maintenance of roads were relatively more homogeneous within the regions. There's obviously there might have been enormous differences in the way they collected taxes and the way they maintain roads between Europe and between the Middle East, but yeah, that's not what we're trying to exploit here. Yeah. Thanks very much. I mean, lots of very useful suggestions to improve identification. For example, matching on geographical determinants, or trying to look whether we could find some information about roads that were planned to be built but they were not built. I think that information would be really hard to find because I don't know if there are records of this type of plans that were not fulfilled. Mapping these roads is terribly difficult. So that's, for example, why we're focusing only on major roads, because even minor roads that are kind of documented are difficult to pin down to follow the exact paths. But definitely would be an interesting source of variation that we could exploit. You had a question about the instrument that I didn't get. You said the validity of the exclusion restriction. Yeah.
I just wanted to make, no one else wants to ask a question, do they? Because otherwise I'll take the rest of the time.
Oh.
So within regions, so that to be able to compare the MENA region and the European region, in some sense want to understand how the relationship between...
I see. Okay, so the answer goes back to this, that they were not really trying to...
No. So you want basically to be able to make the MENA region as a counterfactual, that the underlying process of...
Yes, exactly. But the counterfactual is not the MENA region as compared to the European. It's right, some parts of the MENA region for other parts of the MENA region. Yeah. And you mean I ran out of time, or you also said something very interesting about how to fit this paper into the literature of the economics of infrastructure and how to disconnect. So something that we are doing so far, because I think that's what we can do so far, is just trying to document the pattern of persistence of infrastructure as a proximate determinant of comparative development, which is something relatively unstudied in the literature of the persistence of infrastructure or the economics of infrastructure in general. We're not trying to estimate the returns to building roads, for example, because we are not really sure of several things that you mentioned. For example, we cannot disentangle the creation of prosperity in places where roads were, built from the distribution, the redistribution of prosperity, because now we have a network that allows us to redistribute things. So disentangling these two things would be obviously necessary to estimate a meaningful return on infrastructure. But that's to fit this paper to answer your question, and to fit this paper in the literature on the economics of infrastructure, we are just documenting the persistence of it.
Yeah, super cool paper, I gotta say, because of the maps and all the evidence and the data. I just have a comment related to the previous question about the violation of the SUDVA, because if there are some areas that were treated in terms of being closer to a road, that can affect also likelihood of building nearby, like secondary roads, right? So I was wondering if you check if there's any effect on neighboring areas that could have been affected, and then there will be some implications for general equilibrium effect.
Okay, yeah, that's a good suggestion. Externalities of that we haven't checked, and we still have some room. Approximately 70% of the regions within the former empire got some road, a little or a lot, but the 30% of it didn't get any. So we could expand and try to see whether there are some interesting spillovers in that area. Very good. Thank you very much.
Right. So last presentation before coffee, so hang on everyone. So I'm Gian Luca, I'm a PhD from Nottingham, and here I'll present one of the chapters from my PhD thesis. And so starting with some motivation, while most of human history was characterized by stateless societies, since pretty much the late 19th century, basically the entire world was divided into states. Now, to maintain authority, countries, especially modern ones, require recognition of their state legitimacy by its citizens. And so this confidence, this recognition of legitimacy in institutions, while it's taken pretty much for granted in Western developed country, it's really fundamental for the effective functioning of the state. Because if it's not there, in extreme cases, we have things like revolutions, civil wars, and all of that. Now, there's been, especially in the last 10 years, ample research documenting the influence of history on current outcomes, with what is now a large number of studies showing how historical factors can lead to different and persisting cultural traits. So basically what I'm doing here is to ask whether abstracting from current economic, institutional, political outcome factors, whether this recognition of the state legitimacy is also a persistent trait, there's also a persistent component which is shaped by historical events. And I think that for this, Africa provides an attractive setting because we had several hundreds of relatively self-contained ethnic groups that pursued very different life ways as recently as 5 generations ago, before colonialism and its related consequences, such as the creation of modern countries. So, quick outline, I'll give you a summary of the paper in the next slide, then I'll talk a bit about the data use, the estimation framework, and then I'll present my main results and conclude. So in this paper, I study the effect of state history on present attitudes towards state institutions, where by state history, I mean the length of exposure of a population, a group of people, to a state. And in particular, I focus on what I believe is the mechanism, one of the mechanisms behind this, that is intergenerationally transmitted beliefs. Now, I combine contemporary individual level survey data with historical data on pre-colonial political centralization by ethnic group. And to try and obtain identification, I have a 3-part strategy based on the disease environment of the ethnic group's historical homelands, on the current location of survey respondents, and on the timing of the ethnographic records for the historical data. Now, a preview of my finding is that individuals belonging to ethnic groups that were characterized by a pre-colonial state tend to show significantly higher trust in modern-day institutional figures, and these results even hold for individuals living outside of their ancestral homeland. So I think I'll skip the literature and go to the data. So I employ for the dependent variable individual level survey data from the 3rd and 4th rounds of the Afrobarometer surveys, which were run in 18 countries for the 3rd round and 20 countries shown here for the 4th round. So my dependent variable, the institutional trust index, is obtained from principal component analysis of these survey answers, survey questions, where individuals were asked how much they trust the figure of the president, parliament, police, and courts of law. So they could give answer going from not at all to a lot. And by considering these questions, I wanted not only to capture the different powers of the state, but also both national representatives of the state and more local ones, such as police and courts of law. Next, I have this historical data from the ethnographic atlas. So on the left-hand side, we have the ethnolinguistic map, which was constructed by the anthropologist Murdoch, which displays the spatial distribution of ethnicities across the continent in the late 19th century. So first of all, I matched individuals with the historical data on their ethnic group with the classification by Murdoch by exploiting the self-reported ethnic group that the individuals indicate in the surveys. And from that, I'm able, yes, to match them to the historical data on their group. In particular, what I use is this jurisdictional hierarchies beyond the local community index, which is, in this literature, has become quite a standard variable to capture the state formation, state development of these ethnic groups. And this index has values going from a minimum indicating no political authority beyond the local community to a maximum value indicating states and large states. Now, in terms of estimation, this is my main empirical model. So, on the left-hand side, we have the institutional trust index varying at the individual survey respondent level. On the right-hand side, my interest is the coefficient beta, which is the coefficient on the pre-colonial concentration of ethnic group E, to which individual I belongs. Then we have a series of quite standard individual controls, some location-based controls, such as the presence of public goods in the town or village where the individual lives, and some variables on the ethnic composition of the area. And then some historical ethnic group controls. Some of them also come from the ethnographic atlas. We have the dependence on agriculture, the practice of intensive agriculture, the pre-colonial settlement patterns, and some geographical controls I get from GIS. So we have land area of the homeland, the presence of a coast, agricultural suitability, etc. So as I said at the beginning, I have a three-part strategy for identification. That is, because for now, I've identified what I think are three major tracks to obtain identification, and for each of them, I've employed a separate strategy. So I'm short on time, so I have to be a bit superficial on this, but if you have questions, feel free to ask after the session or during question time. So the first issue is this, what I label this indirect effect of pre-colonial centralization. That is, I need to distinguish the effect working through intergenerational transmission, which is what my interest, from the effect that historical state formation had on current development. So there have been a series of papers, we have mentioned them in the representations, especially this paper by Mikalopoulos and Papaioannou, where they show that historical state formation in Africa is associated with higher development today. So what I want to avoid is that individuals living in more developed area are simply more trusting overall. So what I do is exploit the geocoded location from the surveys and join that with the ethnolinguistic map. So doing this, I'm able to determine which individuals are and which are don't result as living on the ethnic homeland of their group, which are not. And so for this issue, my strategy will be to focus on the subsample of individuals, of what I label as migrants, individuals that don't result as living on the homeland of their group. Next, we have this attenuation bias coming from the fact that pre-colonial centralization is an imprecise measure of state history as I would like it to be. So ideally, I would want a measure of state history that is time varying, but this data I use from the atlas just captures the presence of a state at one point in time. So when this ethnographic data was collected, okay, there is a state or not, but it doesn't give me a time dimension. So it might end up underestimating the effect of state history. So here I exploit data on the one aspect of the historical disease environment, which has been found to have affected state formation. Particularly this data on the historical presence of the tsetse fly, which Marcella Alsen in her 2015 paper has found to have negatively affected historical state formation by limiting agricultural technologies and agricultural practices. So here my strategy will be an IV strategy, where in the first stage I instrument the pre-colonial centralization of the group with the tsetse suitability index of the area associated with their homeland. The last issue has to do with the colonial rule. So while I control for the overall effect at the modern country level with country fixed effects, I'm still, with the data I have, unable to determine how colonization interacted with the single groups I have in the data. In particular, how colonization interacted with their pre-existing political structures, which is my interest. In particular, so while the atlas is meant to measure the characteristics of these groups as they were before colonialism, there is a variable indicating when the ethnographic records took place. And if you look at this, you can see that there's quite a lot of variation in terms of time of the record, and for some groups it were even in 1950, 1960, so well into the colonial period. So my issue here is whether groups whose characteristics were measured later might show some kind of influence, some kind of effect due to colonialism, which I would like to avoid. So I try to get around this by exploiting this time of record variable. So I use time of observation, fixed effects, to carry out a within period comparison. Right, so getting to the findings. So in this table, I show the results I get by employing the different identification strategies. So first of all, you can see by comparing OLS and IV, referring to the attenuation bias, there's quite a difference in size between IV and OLS, with IV coefficient being always at least 2 times in size compared to the OLS ones, which is the attenuation bias underestimating the effect of state history, which I was talking about. Then in terms of the other identification strategies, even when in even number columns, I control for the ethnographic record time, or when in columns 3 and 4, I focus on some sample of migrant individuals compared to the full sample, the coefficients always tell me the same story. That is that, so individuals coming from groups associated with early state formation, with a pre-colonial state, tend to, are associated with a significantly higher institutional trust index today. So these are my main findings. Then I have a series of further results, which I don't have time to talk about now. So I have some robustness checks, some falsification tests, some, I try to look into selection and heterogeneity of results, but if you're interested, feel free to ask about it. So for now, I'll just conclude by saying that in this paper, I studied the effect of state formation on confidence in state institutions, and by at least trying to isolate confounding and omitted factors, I investigate the role played by intergenerationally transmitted beliefs, and find that descendants from groups characterized by a pre-colonial state show on average significantly higher trust in current day institutional figures. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Okay, so really nice and thorough paper about a really interesting question, asking whether historical institutional features are connected with modern day attitudes towards institutions via beliefs that are transmitted culturally or across generations. And I think you made a really, diligent working trying to show that these relationships are very robust. I mean, the comparison is very fine at the individual level, controlling for individual characteristics, social, economic characteristics, of historical characteristics, and you put lots of fixed effects. So it's a very credible result. You add to that falsification exercises and a battery of robustness checks that you didn't present here, but are in the paper, with added credibility, and also you have a theoretical model that illustrates how reliance on tradition can cause beliefs to reflect experiences of past generations, and that individuals with an ancestry of places with a historical centralization of the state tend to trust more in institutions today. So very nice features of a paper that seems very complete. So I just have some potential additions to it, major or so the main one is probably about the theoretical model. You didn't talk a lot about that, but I was asking, whether the theoretical model is really necessary. You have a credible story that comes from the work by Richard Boyd and Peter Richardson, and also Nathan Nunn, and the new cultural economics literature, where you can motivate just based on that you can derive from their testable implications, and you have all the data, and your results would. I didn't really see the need of using a new theoretical model, because there are not really other mechanisms that are not there. The model as it is now also has some strong assumptions. For example, it does not allow for the presence of bad states during the transition out from stateless societies. I think that contradicted a little bit what I know about extractive states, because I thought that extractive states are probably most likely to be the norm than the exception in a historical perspective. So not allowing for bad states in the transition out of a stateless society is kind of contradictory with this a priori idea of the type of states that we had in a historical perspective. There's also this assumption that no state is basically equivalent to a bad state. And then probably one can come out with several examples about how a limited state or something closer to a no state situation could have been actually good, or at least very useful to develop a good state. So again, something that would contradict this idea that no state is bad state. So yeah, and in general, that under the assumptions that you have in the model, which is a very nice short model. Also, the result seems to follow directly from this idea that only states with a longer history create a culture of trust or adaptation to them, and then, it doesn't really. I didn't see much of a need for the model in this sense. But the model has some interesting other predictions that perhaps you could test with the data that you have. For example, in the model you talk about people, different types of people. They could be info seekers, or they could be traditionalists. Traditionalists are going to create obviously more persistence, because once they get used to something, they just start to replicate, to transmit these beliefs or values across generation. But but there are, for example, there's this really interesting new paper by Anne-Sophie Beck-Knudsen, one of my colleagues in Copenhagen, that's showing the characteristics of migrants and the changes in societies that they live and all that. So, for example, I was thinking whether these traditionalists, that people that you are thinking about, are more likely to stay, and these info seekers that you are talking about are more likely to migrate, so that trust in modern institutions is not really about a history of state centralization, but just the fact that of differences in personality traits. For example, the fact that these info seekers that you're talking about are more likely to migrate, and they are the ones who are, more able to have an advantage in creating, in trusting the institutions of the places where they migrate to. I don't know if you have data in the Afrobarometer or other sources of data, other sources that could speak to these personality traits that are an important characteristic of migrants. I was also thinking that you are showing these results in the sample of migrants, and you are showing a very nice result about heterogeneity due to that changes with exposure to co-ethnics, of the number of co-ethnics. So I was thinking whether it would also be interesting to show the results in the sample of non-migrants, because non-migrants is half of your sample, and they will also be affected by a potentially large number of non-co-ethnics that could be affecting their beliefs. So what are the results in the sample of non-migrants? would be the concrete question. I had a question about I thought about your trust index and the idea of exploiting some more details about the characteristics of the state. You build this index based on trust in the president, in the parliament, in the police, and the courts, but you don't really report, you don't really split the index in these 4 components. I mean, it's okay to take the principal component, but it would also be interesting to see whether trust in each of these components is the same. It would also be interesting to split the index in that way because it would help us to grasp a difference between different interesting features of the state. For example, differences between the infrastructural capacity of the state and differences in the coercive capacity of the state, following, for example, what sociologists like Michael Mann talk about. In your case, for example, police would be associated probably with more infrastructural capacity, relatively more infrastructural capacity. The presence of the police could just signal the presence of the state, but the presidents or parliaments could be much more closely related to the coercive capacity of the state, and it would be interesting to see whether trust is driven by the coercive capacity of the state or by just the presence and the infrastructural capacity of the state. I also have a minor point about, fixed effects and your maps, but I think I can tell you that later, so to allow for more questions from the floor.
All right. Questions?
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I'll be glad to talk about it.
Okay, thank you very much. I really like this presentation, but I have a few questions, well, 3 questions actually. So first, I think you could also use the more recent Afrobarometer rounds, no? 5 and 6, then you would have a larger sample. And they also contain trust questions, as far as I know. And then there's also a question on trust in local political institution, like the local assembly or something. Maybe potential that could also be interesting. But yeah, I'm not sure whether you would expect to find a result here as well. I'm not sure. And then concerning the movers, I was wondering whether you were, or whether you actually did this, whether you were also including the state capacity of the ethnicity where the mover lives in. So now you, I think if I understood correctly, you investigate the effect of the state capacity of the respondent's ethnicity, but I think you could also include the state capacity of the ethnicity where he lives. Yeah, I think Anand and Vanchakon did this in their paper, maybe if you know this. And well, lastly, concerning the instrument, I was wondering whether, I think the exclusion restriction would be that that there's only an effect on trust levels through the state capacity, through the effect on state capacity. But I was wondering whether this is likely to hold or whether there could be a potential effect on something else, like an economic outcome or, yeah.
Okay. All right. While other people think about questions. So, there's a recent surveys, I just ended up doing other projects, so I didn't have the time to add, but it's there. So sometimes I have to decide and do it and add them. Local politicians, yes, this is a comment I got, I already had. I should try to add them inside the whole bundle and see what I get. Now, in terms of the mover state capacity, I didn't show it here, but at some point I do some local current location fixed effects for the mover sample. So I employ fixed effects for the location where they are, for the ethnic common where they are now absorbing the current location features, and results seem to hold. And regarding the exclusion restriction, like all exclusion restriction is always more of a matter of faith, but so in my case, I think that if I was talking about trust in general, I would agree with you. So why it's only through this? In this case, since I'm talking about trust in these institutions now, you can argue that this trust in institution is affected by the generalized trust. But being a distrusted institution, I think I can isolate more of a separate channel working through the pre-colonial institution, but no, I agree with you. It's hard to prove that it's only working through this, of course. Other questions?
Thank you for the paper. I think you tried to address this issue, but I'm not 100% sure I understood how. Pre-colonial state capacity is quite correlated with the type of interaction you have with the colonial state. So you're more likely to be a group that receives some kind of authority from the colonial authorities, right? And that will interact, for instance, the kind of public goods you receive from colonial administrations and things like that, which in turn determines trust on the state. So I was wondering how you can address that.
Yeah, so I think that regarding the colonies, there's two separate issues that could be going on. The first one is what I try to do with the time of observation, because as I said, so groups that were measured later, of course the colonizers did had some influence, interacted with this structure, pre-existing structure, so it might be that already by the time that they were measured, they are already showing some kind of influence by the colonizers, some effect. But then there's also the issue of I don't have data on how the colonizer interacted with the single ethnic groups, and which is something I'm trying to work on. So I'm trying to collect data from blue books, at least for English colonies, see if I can get some more disaggregated data on the colonial presence, at least for these colonies. But then there's also the issue that groups that were more developed, more centralized in the pre-colonial period might just be more powerful today. And for that, I have to, it's on my to-do list, I have to do it. I try to include data on ethnic power relations, so to see which are the most powerful groups in the country, because then I might be capturing something related to that.